the 1970s. I met him in about 1976, and his name was Blaze Foley. Any of you people familiar with Blaze Foley's music? Well, Blaze was incredible. He was like no one else I think that ever lived, and basically when I met him, he had just written a whole bunch of songs, and he wrote these really gorgeous, tender ballads that just kind of made me weep, and he was just a very tender, sort of gentle soul, and yet at the same time he was a giant, drunken, brawling problem person. He was one of those guys. He'd been kicked out of every bar he'd ever been in, I think, and I'd seen him get kicked out of a whole bunch of bars, and I'd seen him get beaten up. But I loved him, and he was really just a generous person, just a walking contradiction. And Blaze never got to really record an album in his lifetime. He never had one released in his lifetime. We recorded some songs back in 1979 and 1980 in Houston, Texas, and in Fredericksburg, Texas. And we were 95% done with this project, and Blaze, for some reason, I don't know what it was, he was driving around in this car someone loaned him, and he had the master tapes. He took them out of the studio, and he's driving around with them in this station wagon. And you never do that, because if anything happens to your master tapes, your project is finished. So he's driving around with them, and someone breaks into the car, and they steal the master tapes. And I'm sure they ended up in a dumpster in about 30 seconds. They weren't of value to anyone except to Blaze and me. And I asked him, I said, Blaze, why did they steal our tapes? And he said, they took them because they were shiny. Makes sense, really. Anyhow, I had what was the only copy of what we had done to that point, and it was on a cassette, and so it wasn't good enough to release, and our project was just finished. So I could listen to it, but that was all it was ever going to be. And Blaze ended up, well, he came over to my house one time about 3 years later, and he knew I had this copy, and he said, I'd like to make a copy of your cassette. And I said, sure, and I set him up with 2 cassette machines, and I handed him the cassette, and I handed him a blank cassette. I wired it all up for him, and in a drunken stupor, he proceeds to put the cassettes in the wrong machine and presses record. He raises a big hole into the only existing copy of what we had done. And that didn't surprise me. That was a very Blaze-like thing to happen. And so then Blaze ended up getting murdered in 1989. And that didn't surprise me either. He was defending an old man, an old drinking buddy of his, and I knew that call would be coming sometime. He just was sort of bound for that. And then I got a phone call about 3 years ago from an engineer that worked in the studio where we had recorded that stuff, and he said, you'll never guess what I found. I found a safety copy of the Blaze Foley stuff, and I said, send it to me immediately. And we put it out. We released it a year or two ago as a record called Blaze Foley and the Beaver Valley Boys' Cold, Cold World. And I wanted to play that song, Cold, Cold World, for you, just so you can kind of get some sort of an idea what kind of a writer Blaze was. I've tried for a long time, but I think I can win. I could do it all better, I could do it again. Wherever I'm going is the same place I've been. Ain't it a cold, cold world? That old lady asked me about the new daylight time. I said it don't matter. She said I don't mind. Then the bus driver said, you still owe me a dime. Ain't it a cold, cold world? Outside it was hot, but inside I was cold. The The eyes of the young met the eyes of the old, and what they were thinking I'll never be told. Ain't it a cold, cold world? Can't get no job and I can't get no rest. I started out east, but I ended up west. And I'm so glad to be here, I'm sure I would guess. Ain't it a cold, cold world? I might have to leave you, I think's what she said. I wish I could sleep instead of tossing in bed. I can find myself thinking that I'd rather be dead. Ain't it a cold, cold world? Ain't it